The billionaire left his ex for his secretary and thought he'd made the right choice. Years later, he saw her standing outside his wedding holding twins he didn't know existed. And in that moment, he realized the woman he believed had been lying the whole time, while the woman he was about to marry had built her entire relationship on a lie so devastating it would cost him everything. You know what? This is a beautiful story for my wonderful family. Hello, my beautiful family. Welcome back to the channel. And if this is your first time here, welcome to our storytelling family, where love, faith, and second chances come alive. To all my loyal subscribers, thank you so much for your love and support. I see your comments, your prayers, and your amens every day, and I don't take them for granted. You all mean so much to me. Before we begin today's story, let's say a short prayer. Lord, bless everyone listening today. May this story heal hearts, inspire faith, and remind us of your endless love. In Jesus' name, amen. If you're watching this right now, comment amen and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and like this video for more inspiring stories. Now let's dive into the story together. She stood in the rain holding 2 newborn babies, while her husband married another woman inside the church behind her. Thunder cracked across the sky as Ariel Monroe pressed both infants against her chest, their tiny bodies wrapped in hospital blankets already soaked through. And through the stained glass windows, she could see him standing at the altar in his perfect tuxedo next to the woman who destroyed everything. The babies were 3 days old, and he didn't even know they existed. This is the story of how a billionaire's secretary told one lie that ended a marriage, stole a fortune, and separated a man from his own children before they took their first breath, and what happened when the truth finally came for her on the day she thought she'd won. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications because stories like this don't come often, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from because this truth needs to reach everywhere. Lightning illuminated Ariel's face, and for just a moment the groom inside turned toward the window as if he felt something watching him from a storm. Elias Davenport, 34 years old, heir to a commercial real estate empire worth $3 billion, stood frozen mid-vow as rain hammered against the century-old church in downtown Boston. His new bride squeezed his hand to pull his attention back, but his eyes stayed fixed on that window, on that shadow he couldn't quite see, on the ghost of something he'd thrown away 8 months earlier when he made the worst decision of his life. The officiant cleared his throat and Elias blinked, turning back to face Serena Vale, the woman in white who had convinced him his pregnant wife was a liar and a cheat. But outside in the rain, holding the proof of his blindness in her trembling arms, Ariel wasn't thinking about revenge yet. She was thinking about the moment Elias first kissed her 4 years ago under an umbrella, exactly like this storm, laughing because they were both terrible at staying dry. She was thinking about the morning she told him she was pregnant, and he lifted her off the ground spinning in circles, while tears ran down his face. She was thinking about the night he came home with murder in his eyes and accusations on his lips, and she couldn't make him listen no matter how many times she begged him to just look at her, really look at her, and see that she was telling the truth. One of the twins started crying and Ariel rocked her body instinctively, humming through chattering teeth while rain plastered her dark hair to her skull. The church doors were 40 feet away, and she'd been standing here for 20 minutes, trying to decide if she had the strength to walk through them. Security had thrown her out of these doors 8 months ago, when she was 7 months pregnant, dragged her by both arms while Elias watched from the top of the stairs with his jaw clenched and his secretary's hand on his shoulder. That was the last time she saw him before today. That was the last time she tried to tell him the truth before her voice broke completely and she stopped fighting the hands pulling her toward the street. Would you have given up or would you have kept fighting? Drop your answer in the comments, because I need to know what you would have done in her position. Inside the church, Serena's father was crying, and her mother was filming everything on her phone, and 200 guests were smiling at the beautiful couple finally saying their vows after such a tragic scandal. The papers had called Ariel a gold digger who got pregnant by her personal trainer and tried to trap a billionaire. The tabloids ran photos of her leaving a hotel with a man Serena's people had hired to walk beside her at exactly the right moment for the cameras. Social media tore her apart for weeks, calling her trash and worse. sending death threats to her family's address until her parents had to move in with her sister upstate. Elias had filed for divorce within 72 hours. His lawyers moving so fast Ariel barely had time to understand what was happening before everything she owned was frozen, and she was locked out of their penthouse with nothing but the clothes she wore that day. She'd given birth alone in a county hospital 3 days ago because the private doctors wouldn't see her without insurance, and Elias had canceled everything the moment his lawyers filed the papers. No one was there to hold her hand when the contractions made her scream. No one was there to cut the umbilical cords or take the first photos or tell her she was doing great when she thought she might die from the pain of pushing out 2 babies back to back. The nurses were kind but rushed, and when they asked for the father's name to put on the birth certificates, she'd stared at the wall and whispered that he was dead because it felt true enough, because the man she'd married wouldn't have let this happen to her, and the man who threw her out had to be someone else entirely. The second twin woke up now, and both babies were crying in harmony, their small voices almost lost under the thunder. Ariel's legs were shaking, and she knew she needed to move, needed to get them somewhere warm. But the church doors held her frozen like a magnet. Elias was in there promising forever to the woman who'd orchestrated this nightmare with surgical precision. Serena Vale, 28 years old, Harvard Business School graduate, Elias's executive secretary for 3 years, the woman who'd smiled at Ariel over coffee and asked about baby names and offered to help plan the nursery while she was secretly planting evidence and building lies. What kind of person smiles at a pregnant woman while plotting to destroy her entire life? Comment below, because I genuinely want to understand how someone becomes that evil. Ariel had the proof now, finally, after 8 months of digging. A private investigator she'd paid with money borrowed from her sister had found the paper trail, the connections, the truth that would unravel everything Serena had built. The flash drive in Ariel's coat pocket contained bank records showing payments to the man in those hotel photos. Phone records showing Serena had been texting Elias's business rivals for years, and one final piece of evidence that would detonate like a bomb when it went public. But standing here in the rain, with her newborn children crying against her chest, Ariel wasn't sure she had the strength to walk through those doors and blow up his wedding in front of 200 people. Thunder rolled across the sky again, and through the window, she watched Elias lean down to kiss his new bride. Serena's arms went around his neck, and the crowd erupted in applause, and Ariel felt something crack open inside her chest that had nothing to do with heartbreak anymore. These babies deserved a father. These children deserved to know the man who made them, who wanted them so desperately he cried the day he found out they existed. And Elias deserved to know what he'd done, who he'd believed, and what it had cost all of them. She took one step forward and then another, and by the third step she was walking toward those church doors with purpose burning through the exhaustion. The rain fell harder now, sheets of water that made it almost impossible to see. But Ariel kept moving, because turning back wasn't an option anymore. One of the twins had stopped crying, and the other one was making small hiccuping sounds, and she held them both tighter as she climbed the stone steps leading to the entrance. Security had been posted here earlier, but the ceremony was over now, and they'd moved inside to monitor the reception, which meant the doors were unguarded for the first time all day. Ariel's hand touched the iron handle and she paused for just a moment, looking down at the 2 tiny faces pressed against her soaking, wet coat. They had his eyes. They had his nose. They had his stubborn little chin. And when they grew up, they would ask her why their father wasn't there when they were born, and she would have to decide whether to tell them the truth or let them believe a kinder lie. But that decision was for later, for years from now, when they could understand complexity and betrayal, and the way love sometimes makes people blind to the predators standing right beside them. Right now, in this moment, with thunder shaking the church walls and rain drowning out every sound except her own heartbeat, Ariel pulled open the door and stepped inside. 2 months after Elias kicked Ariel out of their home, she gave birth to twins in a county hospital with fluorescent lights that hummed too loud and nurses who didn't have time to hold her hand through the contractions that felt like her body was being torn in half. The boy came first at 4 a.m, screaming before he even fully entered the world, and the girl followed 12 minutes later, so quiet the doctor had to suction her airways twice before she finally cried. Ariel named them Noah and Luna because those were the names she and Elias had chosen together during a weekend in Cape Cod when her belly was just starting to show, and he'd spent an entire afternoon talking to her stomach about constellations and ocean tides. The nurses asked for the father's information, and Ariel said he was dead because in every way that mattered to her broken heart he was, and they wrote unknown on both birth certificates in the space where Elias Davenport's name should have been. She took the babies home to her sister's 2-bedroom apartment in Malden, where she was sleeping on a pull-out couch that had springs poking through the mattress. Her sister Tessa was a middle school teacher who could barely afford her own rent, but had opened her door without hesitation when Ariel showed up 7 months pregnant with everything she owned in 2 garbage bags. Tessa worked during the day, and Ariel stayed home with the twins, learning how to breastfeed and change diapers and function on 90-minute increments of sleep. And at night when both babies were finally quiet, she would sit by the window looking at the Boston skyline and wonder if Elias ever thought about her anymore. The penthouse they'd shared was visible from here if you knew exactly where to look, a tiny rectangle of light among thousands. And sometimes Ariel would see the lights turn on late at night and imagine him standing in their kitchen making terrible pancakes alone. But Elias wasn't alone, and he wasn't thinking about pancakes. 6 weeks after he threw Ariel out, he'd started dating Serena because she understood him in ways his ex-wife apparently never had. Or at least that's what he told himself when the guilt tried to surface at 3 a.m. Serena was everything Ariel wasn't, polished and sophisticated and connected to his world in ways that made sense to his family. His mother approved immediately, and his father said it was about time Elias started dating within his social class. And both of them conveniently forgot that they'd been at his wedding to Ariel just 3 years earlier. Serena moved into the penthouse 2 months into their relationship and redecorated immediately, removing every trace of Ariel's flea market finds and replacing them with designer furniture that cost more than most people's cars. She erased Ariel from that space so completely that within 6 months Elias could almost convince himself his first marriage had been a fever dream he'd finally woken up from. Almost, but not quite, because some nights he'd find himself standing in what was supposed to be the nursery, staring at empty walls and wondering if the twins had been boys or girls. The divorce had been finalized while Ariel was 8 months pregnant, and his lawyers had made sure he had no legal obligation to children conceived during a marriage he could prove was based on infidelity and fraud. Except the proof was fabricated and the fraud was on his side, and Elias had no idea he'd been played so perfectly that he destroyed his own family with his own hands. He'd asked Serena once if she thought he'd been too harsh, if maybe he should have let Ariel explain before cutting her off completely. And Serena had kissed his forehead and reminded him that weak men let women walk all over them, but strong men protect themselves from manipulators. He'd believed her, because believing her was easier than facing what it would mean if he'd been wrong. Have you ever convinced yourself of a lie because the truth was too painful to face? Drop a comment, because I think we've all been there in different ways. The proposal happened on a yacht in the harbor during a party celebrating a development deal that would add another $100 million to the Davenport portfolio. Elias got down on one knee in front of 50 of Boston's wealthiest families and offered Serena a ring that cost twice what he'd spent on Ariel's because Serena had made comments about size mattering, and he wanted to prove his commitment was real this time. She said yes with perfect surprise, even though she'd planned the entire moment down to the photographer's angle. And when Elias kissed her, the crowd applauded, and his mother cried happy tears, and somewhere across the city Ariel saw the engagement announcement on her phone and had to run to the bathroom to throw up. The wedding was scheduled for 6 months later. Enough time to plan something spectacular, but not so long that Elias might start questioning whether he was moving too fast. Serena planned everything with military precision, booking the most exclusive church in Boston and hiring a wedding planner who'd coordinated events for celebrities and politicians. The guest list was 200 people carefully curated to include everyone who mattered in their social circle, and conspicuously absent was anyone who'd been close to Ariel or might ask uncomfortable questions about how quickly Elias had moved on. The dress cost $40,000 and required 6 fittings, and Serena's mother flew in from wherever she'd been hiding for the past 3 years to cry over fabric swatches and pretend she'd always dreamed of this day. Elias paid for everything without question because money had never mattered to him, except as a way to show love. And if Serena wanted a wedding that would be talked about for years, then that's what she would get. But while Serena was selecting floral arrangements and tasting cakes, Ariel was scraping together money to hire a private investigator. Her sister had taken out a loan she couldn't afford, and Ariel had sold everything of value she still owned, including her grandmother's pearl necklace. And together they'd managed to put $5,000 into the hands of a retired detective named Marcus Chun, who specialized in corporate fraud. Ariel had given him everything she could remember about the photos and the timeline and the way things had fallen apart so quickly it felt orchestrated. And Marcus had promised nothing, but said he'd look into it. 3 months later he'd called her at 2 in the morning and told her to meet him at a diner in Dorchester. And when she arrived he'd slid a folder across the table that would change everything. The man in the hotel photos was an actor named Trevor something who'd been paid $5,000 cash to walk near Ariel at specific times in specific locations. The photos weren't doctored, but they were staged, angles chosen to make it look like they were together when they'd actually been strangers passing on a sidewalk. The bank records showing Ariel moving money into private accounts had been created using software sophisticated enough to fool initial inspection, but not deep forensic analysis. The anonymous text Elias had received had come from a burner phone purchased at a store where security footage showed Serena buying 3 identical phones the week before the messages started. And the final piece of evidence was the one that made Ariel's hands shake so hard she almost dropped the folder. A background check on Serena Vale that revealed her real name was Serena Castellano, and her father was Vincent Castellano, the CEO of Meridian Holdings, the company that had been trying to acquire Davenport properties for 5 years before Elias's father blocked the deal and publicly humiliated Vincent at a shareholder meeting. This wasn't a love story, it was a revenge plot, and Ariel had been collateral damage in a scheme designed to destroy the Davenport family from the inside. Do you see it now? Comment if you figured out Serena was playing the long game, because this is where it gets really dark. Marcus explained that Serena had likely been planted in the company years ago, specifically to get close to Elias, that the affair and the pregnancy and the perfect timing of it all was probably orchestrated to either trap him in a marriage that would give the Castellano family access to Davenport assets, or destroy his first marriage and leave him vulnerable to manipulation. The private accounts in Ariel's name had been set up to look like she was hiding money, when really it was Serena siphoning funds through shell companies registered to offshore entities that connected back to Meridian Holdings. The entire operation was sophisticated enough that if it had been completed successfully, the Davenports would have lost control of their company before they even understood what was happening. Elias had thought he was protecting himself from a gold digger, when really he'd been handing his entire empire to the daughter of his family's biggest enemy. Ariel had sat in that diner booth staring at evidence that proved her innocence, but couldn't undo the past 9 months of hell she'd survived. She had the proof that would destroy Serena and vindicate herself, but she also had 2 3-month-old babies who needed to be fed and changed and loved. And using this information meant walking back into a world that had already tried to destroy her once. Marcus had told her she could take this to the police, that wire fraud and identity theft were serious crimes. But Ariel knew that rich people rarely faced consequences when their lawyers were expensive enough. She'd thanked Marcus and taken the folder and gone home to her sister's apartment where she'd hidden the evidence in a shoebox under her bed and tried to decide what to do with information that felt like holding a live grenade. For 2 months, she did nothing because exhaustion and fear made it easier to just survive each day than to plan some kind of confrontation. The twins were growing and starting to smile, and Noah had Elias's laugh, while Luna had his serious expression when she concentrated on her tiny fists. Ariel would watch them discover their own fingers and roll over for the first time, and she'd think about how Elias was missing all of it. How he'd wanted this so desperately, and now he was about to marry the woman who'd stolen it from him. Her sister kept asking what she was going to do with the evidence, and Ariel kept saying she didn't know. But the truth was she was terrified because going to war with someone like Serena meant risking everything, including the fragile stability she'd barely managed to build. Then the wedding invitation arrived in her sister's mailbox, forwarded from Ariel's old address by someone who either had a cruel sense of humor or genuinely didn't realize what they were doing. The thick cream cardstock with embossed gold lettering invited her to witness the union of Elias Davenport and Serena Vale on a Saturday afternoon at a church Ariel recognized because she'd gotten married there too in a small ceremony that hadn't required 200 guests or a $40,000 dress. Tessa had found Ariel sitting on the kitchen floor holding the invitation with tears running down her face. And when her sister asked what she wanted to do, Ariel had looked at the shoebox evidence under her bed and said it was time to stop running from the woman who destroyed her life. The plan was simple in theory, but terrifying in execution. Ariel would go to the wedding with the twins and the evidence, and she would walk into that church and make Elias see the truth he'd been too blind to recognize 9 months ago. Marcus had helped her put together a presentation on a flash drive, something visual and undeniable that couldn't be explained away with more lies. And Tessa had agreed to drive her there and wait outside in case everything went wrong and Ariel needed a fast exit. They'd practiced what Ariel would say 100 times, trying different approaches from angry to calm to heartbroken. And eventually they'd settled on letting the evidence speak for itself, because no speech would ever be as powerful as proof. The day of the wedding arrived cold and wet with rain that felt appropriate for what Ariel was about to do. She dressed the twins in white outfits that Tessa had bought because Ariel said if she was going to ruin Serena's wedding, she wanted her babies to look angelic while doing it. Noah and Luna were 3 months old now, big enough to hold their heads up and look around with curious eyes that saw everything and understood nothing. Ariel fed them and changed them and packed a bag with bottles and diapers and the flash drive that contained evidence of conspiracy and fraud. And when Tessa asked if she was sure about this, Ariel said no, but she was doing it anyway because her children deserved a father and Elias deserved to know what he'd done. Would you have gone to that wedding, or would you have just sent the evidence to his lawyers? Comment your choice, because I genuinely don't know what the right answer is here. They arrived at the church 30 minutes before the ceremony started, and Ariel's plan had been to walk in early and find Elias before everything began. But security was everywhere, and they recognized her from the night they dragged her out of the penthouse. And when she tried to enter through the side door, 2 men in suits had physically blocked her path and told her she wasn't welcome. Ariel had argued that she had information Elias needed to know before he made a terrible mistake. And they'd laughed and said if she didn't leave immediately, they'd call the police and have her arrested for violating the restraining order that had technically expired. But they figured she didn't know that. Tessa had pulled her back to the car before things escalated. And they'd sat there trying to figure out what to do while rain started falling and guests began arriving in expensive cars. That's when Ariel made the decision that would define everything that came next. She told Tessa to take the twins and wait in the car, and she was going to stand outside the church in the rain, where Elias would eventually see her through the windows. Tessa said that was insane, and she'd get pneumonia and accomplish nothing. But Ariel wasn't listening anymore, because standing in the rain holding her babies felt like the only language Elias might finally understand. So she'd gotten out of the car with Noah and Luna bundled against her chest, and she'd walked to a spot where she could see through the stained glass into the church, and she'd stood there while rain soaked through her clothes and thunder rolled across the sky, and inside the warm, dry church Elias prepared to marry his own destruction. But forever came with a deadline, and that deadline was approaching fast. Serena Vale wasn't her real name, and the woman wearing white inside that church wasn't who anyone thought she was. She'd been born Serena Castellano 28 years ago to a father who taught her that revenge was a dish best served with a smile, and a mother who showed her that men were easiest to destroy when they thought you loved them. Vincent Castellano had lost everything when the Davenports blocked his acquisition attempt. His company nearly collapsed, and his reputation was shattered in business circles that never forgot humiliation. And he'd spent 5 years plotting a comeback that would take everything from a family that had taken everything from him. His daughter was his weapon, and she'd sharpened herself into something deadly behind a facade so perfect that no one ever saw the blade until it was already buried deep. The plan had started 3 years before Ariel ever met Elias. Back when Serena was fresh out of Harvard Business School with credentials impressive enough to get her an interview at Davenport Properties. She'd studied Elias for months before applying, learned everything about his preferences and weaknesses and the kind of woman he respected in professional settings. She'd made herself indispensable within weeks, anticipating his needs before he voiced them and solving problems before they became crises. And when his previous secretary, retired Serena, had been the obvious choice for promotion. Elias's father had actually recommended her, without knowing she was Vincent Castellano's daughter, because she'd legally changed her name years ago and buried her family connections under layers of shell companies and false paperwork that could survive all but the deepest background checks. For 2 years, Serena watched and waited while Elias fell in love with Ariel, and she hated every moment of watching him be happy with someone so ordinary and unworthy of the Davenport name. But she'd smiled through engagement parties and wedding planning and pregnancy announcements, playing the role of supportive secretary who was genuinely happy for her boss, even while she was documenting every detail she could use against them later. She'd attended their small wedding in Maine and brought a gift and hugged Ariel like they were friends. And the whole time she was thinking about how satisfying it would be to watch that same woman crying in the streets with nowhere to go. The manipulation had required patience that most people didn't possess, but Serena had learned from her father that the best revenge was thorough and irreversible. So she'd waited for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when Ariel got pregnant because pregnant women were vulnerable and men got irrational when they thought their children weren't really theirs. Serena had hired the actor and staged the photos and created the bank accounts and sent the anonymous messages, each piece of evidence carefully crafted to tell a story that would seem undeniable when viewed together. She'd known Elias well enough by then to predict exactly how he'd react, the pride that would make him refuse to listen, and the hurt that would turn into rage faster than reason could intervene. She'd been in his office the night he got the first photos, watching his face change from confusion to devastation, and she'd planted the first seeds of doubt so gently he thought they were his own thoughts forming naturally. Can you imagine spending years of your life plotting to destroy someone you barely know just because your father told you to? Comment if that level of calculated evil makes sense to you, because I'm still trying to understand it. The seduction had been almost too easy once Ariel was gone, and Elias was drowning in guilt and anger with no one to talk to except the secretary, who worked late every night and always knew exactly what to say. Serena had let him vent for weeks before she ever touched him, building trust first and attraction second. And when she finally kissed him in his office during a thunderstorm 6 weeks, after the divorce, he'd pulled back and said this was wrong. She'd agreed and said they should forget it happened, knowing that telling a man not to want something was the fastest way to make him obsess over it. 3 days later, he'd shown up at her apartment at midnight, and they'd slept together for the first time. And Serena had made sure it was exactly what he needed to feel wanted and understood after months of feeling betrayed and alone. The relationship had progressed exactly according to plan, with Serena managing every variable, like a chess master moving pieces across a board. She'd introduced him to her fake family, actors she'd hired to play wealthy socialites who approved of Elias and thought he was perfect for their daughter. She'd slowly integrated herself into his life and his business, gaining access to accounts and files and meetings that she reported back to her real father, who was using the information to position Meridian Holdings for a hostile takeover. The engagement had been her idea planted so carefully that Elias thought he'd come up with it himself, and the wedding was scheduled for exactly the moment when Serena would have enough legal access to Davenport assets to execute the final phase of her father's plan. But standing at that altar watching rain hammer against the windows, Serena felt something she hadn't planned for creeping into her chest like ice water in her veins. Fear, because the security team had just radioed that Elias's ex-wife was outside in the rain holding 2 babies and refusing to leave. Fear, because Ariel was supposed to be broken and hiding and nowhere near this church on this day. Fear, because if Elias saw those babies, he might start asking questions that Serena couldn't answer, without revealing cracks in the perfect story she constructed. She'd squeezed his hand tighter during the vows and tried to keep his attention focused forward, but she'd seen him glance toward that window, and she knew that somewhere deep in whatever was left of his heart, he was still connected to the woman he'd thrown away. The ceremony had continued despite the thunder, And Serena had said her vows with a smile that didn't reach her eyes because she was too busy calculating contingencies for what would happen if Ariel actually made it inside. Her father was in the third row watching everything with satisfaction because he thought this wedding meant victory. But Serena knew that victory was never certain until every possible threat was eliminated completely. She'd worked too hard and waited too long to let a desperate ex-wife with circumstantial evidence ruin the endgame. So when the officiant asked if anyone objected to this union, Serena had held her breath and prayed to gods she didn't believe that those church doors would stay closed. Have you ever been so close to getting everything you wanted that you could taste it, and then felt it all start slipping away? Drop a comment, because that's exactly where Serena was standing when everything she'd built started to crumble. The kiss had sealed the marriage legally, but Serena knew it meant nothing if Elias's doubts started surfacing before they could transfer assets and finalize the corporate merger her father had planned. She turned toward the crowd with her new husband's hand in hers and smiled for the cameras. And through the window she'd seen a shadow standing in the rain and known with absolute certainty that Ariel wasn't going to disappear quietly. The reception was supposed to be in the church hall, but Serena suggested they move to the limo, first for privacy, needing to get Elias away from that building before Ariel found a way inside. But as they walked down the aisle through applauding guests, the thunder that had been building all afternoon finally cracked, so loud the church windows rattled. And in the silence that followed, everyone heard it clearly. A baby crying somewhere outside. Elias had frozen mid-step, and Serena felt her perfect plan fracturing like glass under pressure, because she knew that sound would trigger something in him that her lies couldn't override. She tried to pull him forward, but his hand had slipped from hers, and he turned toward the entrance, where security was suddenly moving with urgency. Someone in the crowd asked what was happening, and another guest checked their phone and gasped. And within seconds the whispers were spreading through the pews that Elias's pregnant ex-wife was outside with newborn twins, claiming they were his. Serena's father had stood up immediately, understanding that their scheme was about to be exposed. And Serena had grabbed Elias's arm and told him it was just another desperate lie from a woman who'd already proven she couldn't be trusted. But Elias had pulled away from her and started walking toward those church doors. And Serena had followed, knowing that everything she'd built over 3 years of meticulous planning was about to explode in her face, because she'd underestimated how much a man could still love the woman he thought he hated. And watching from the window, rain-soaked and shivering with babies screaming against her chest, Ariel had seen him finally turn toward her and start moving. And she'd known that after 9 months of silence, she was about to get the confrontation that would either save them all or destroy what was left of her completely. The church doors opened and Elias stepped into the rain, still wearing his tuxedo. And for 5 full seconds he just stood there staring at Ariel like he was seeing a ghost he tried to bury but had risen from the grave anyway. She was soaked through and shaking and holding 2 tiny bundles against her chest. And even from 10 feet away, he could see how much weight she'd lost and how exhausted she looked, and something in his chest cracked open that he'd spent 9 months trying to keep sealed shut. Behind him, Serena was screaming for security, and his mother was demanding someone call the police. But Elias couldn't hear any of it over the sound of rain, and his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, because those babies Ariel was holding had his eyes and his nose, and suddenly 9 months of certainty was dissolving into doubt, so profound he felt like the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. Ariel took 1 step forward, and her voice came out raw and broken when she said his name. Just Elias, like it was a prayer or a curse or both at once. He'd wanted to say something cutting, something that would remind her she destroyed them with her lies. But the words died in his throat because the woman standing in front of him didn't look like someone who'd cheated and schemed. She looked like someone who'd survived something terrible and had come back anyway. She told him they needed to talk, and he said there was nothing to talk about because he'd just married someone else. And she'd laughed this horrible bitter sound and said she knew, and that's why she was here, because he'd married the woman who destroyed their entire lives with lies he'd been too proud to question. Security arrived then, trying to escort Ariel away, but Elias held up his hand to stop them, because something in the way she'd said made his blood run cold with the first real doubt he'd allowed himself since the night he'd seen those photos. Serena was beside him now, pulling at his arm and telling him this was just another manipulation and they needed to get back inside. But Elias shook her off because he was finally looking at Ariel really looking, and seeing things he'd refused to see 9 months ago when rage had made him blind. The desperation in her eyes wasn't the desperation of someone caught in a lie. It was the desperation of someone who'd been screaming truth into a void and finally had one last chance to make someone listen. Would you have listened or would you have walked away? Comment, because this is the moment everything could have still gone either way. Ariel reached into her soaking coat and pulled out a flash drive sealed in a plastic bag. And she told Elias that everything he thought he knew about her was a lie planted by the woman he'd just married. She said Serena's real name was Castellano, and her father was Vincent Castellano, and Elias felt his stomach drop because he knew that name and knew what his own father had done to that family's company 5 years ago. She said the photos were staged and the bank accounts were fabricated, and she'd never touched another man in her entire marriage because she'd loved him so completely she forgot to protect herself when someone wanted to hurt them both. She said these babies were his children born 3 days ago in a county hospital where she'd labored alone because he'd frozen all their accounts and left her with nothing. And their names were Noah and Luna because those were the names they'd chosen together, and she'd kept them even though he hadn't earned the right to know them. Every word hit Elias like a physical blow, and he stood there in the rain trying to process information that rewrote the past 9 months of his life into something unrecognizable. Serena was screaming now that Ariel was lying, and this was exactly the kind of manipulation she'd about, but her voice had an edge of panic that Elias had never heard before, and it made him wonder what else he'd missed, while he'd been so certain of his own righteousness. His father had pushed through the crowd and was demanding Elias get back inside immediately and handle the circus privately. But Elias couldn't move because he was staring at those babies and seeing his own face reflected back in features too specific to be coincidence. Ariel's sister Tessa appeared then with a laptop already open, and she told Elias that if he had any decency left he'd watch what was on this drive before he threw away his family a second time. Security tried to stop her, but Elias told them to let her through, and Tessa set up the laptop on the church steps, while 200 wedding guests crowded behind them, and Serena's father started moving toward the exit, understanding that exposure was seconds away. The video started playing, and it showed bank transaction records with timestamps proving the fake accounts had been created from an IP address registered to a computer in Davenport Properties, specifically from Serena's workstation. It showed the burner phone purchases on security footage, with Serena's face clear as day. It showed the actor's signed confession about being paid to walk near Ariel for staged photographs. It showed corporate documents linking Serena Vale to the Castellano family through shell companies designed to hide her real identity during background checks. The final piece was a recorded conversation between Serena and her father from 2 weeks ago, discussing the timeline for transferring Davenport assets once the marriage was legal. Vincent's voice crystal clear as he congratulated his daughter on the best corporate espionage operation he'd ever witnessed. The recording had been obtained illegally by Marcus, the private investigator, who'd planted a bug in Serena's car. And it wouldn't hold up in court, but it didn't need to, because the truth wasn't for judges. It was for Elias, who was standing there watching his entire world collapse into a nightmare he'd built with his own hands. When the video ended, there was silence except for rain and thunder and one of the twins crying, and Elias turned to look at Serena with an expression that made her take 3 steps backward. Have you ever realized you destroyed everything that mattered because you believed the wrong person? Drop a comment if you've ever felt that kind of soul-crushing regret. Serena tried to explain, but her voice was shaking, and the explanations came out tangled and contradictory. And within 30 seconds, everyone watching knew she was guilty of exactly what the evidence suggested. Elias's father started screaming about lawsuits and criminal charges and how the Castellano family would pay for this attack. But Elias wasn't listening because he was walking toward Ariel, who was still standing in the rain holding babies that should have been born in the penthouse nursery he'd painted blue and pink before everything fell apart. He reached out to touch one of the twins, and Ariel flinched away instinctively, and that flinch broke something in Elias that would never fully heal because it meant she was afraid of him now, and he'd earned that fear through cruelty he could never take back. He asked if he could hold them, and Ariel said no, not yet, not until he understood what he'd done and what it cost, and whether he was capable of being the father these children deserved. She said he'd thrown her into the streets 7 months pregnant and blocked her from accessing money for medical care and let the media destroy her reputation while he played happy family with the enemy's daughter. She said Noah went to the NICU for 2 days because he was early and she couldn't afford the specialists. And Luna had colic that kept her screaming for hours, while Ariel sat alone in her sister's apartment wondering if this was how her children would remember their first months of life. She said every milestone he'd missed was a choice he'd made to believe lies instead of the woman who'd never lied to him once in 4 years of marriage. And if he wanted to meet his children, he'd have to prove he deserved them, because biology wasn't enough anymore. Elias dropped to his knees in the rain and started crying, actually crying in front of 200 people who were recording this on their phones for social media that would make it viral within hours. He said he was sorry over and over like the words might undo 9 months of destruction, and Ariel looked down at him with something between pity and rage and told him sorry wasn't enough, but it was a start. Behind them, Serena was being escorted away by Elias's security, who were no longer taking orders from her, and her father had already disappeared into a car that peeled out of the parking lot before anyone could stop him. The wedding guests were leaving in confused clusters, trying to understand what they'd just witnessed, and Elias's mother was sitting on the church steps with her head in her hands, realizing her son had just ruined his life twice in 1 year. Tessa told Ariel they needed to get the babies somewhere warm and dry before they got sick, and Ariel nodded, but couldn't seem to make her legs move after standing in the rain for so long. Elias stood up and tried to help her, but she pulled away and said she didn't need his help now after surviving 9 months without it. He asked where she was staying, and she said her sister's apartment in Malden. And the look on his face when he realized she'd been that close this entire time while he'd been living in luxury with her replacement was something between devastation and self-loathing. He told her he'd send a car and pay for a hotel and make sure she had everything she needed. And Ariel said she didn't want his money. She wanted him to see what he'd done and live with it every day for the rest of his life. Do you think she should forgive him or make him suffer? Comment on your verdict, because this man has to face consequences either way. She walked away, then still holding both twins against her chest, and Tessa followed with the laptop, while Elias stood in the rain watching his family disappear for the second time, knowing this time it was entirely his fault. 2 newborn cries broke the silence as they reached the car, and not even he was there to hear them clearly, because he'd chosen pride over truth and rage over love, and now he was standing alone in his wedding tuxedo, having just destroyed both his marriages in the span of 1 year. The rain kept falling and the church emptied, and somewhere in the city Serena Castellano was calling her lawyers, knowing her life was about to become a criminal investigation. But none of that mattered to Elias, because all he could think about was the way Ariel had flinched when he reached for his own children, and how he'd earned that fear through blindness he could never claim was anything but his own choice. The video of Elias's wedding disaster went viral within 3 hours, and by midnight it had 40 million views across every social media platform that existed. Someone had recorded the entire confrontation from the moment Ariel appeared with the twins to the moment she walked away, and the internet had collectively decided that this was the most dramatic real-life story they'd witnessed all year. The comments were brutal and divided. Half the world calling Elias a monster who deserved to suffer, and the other half saying he'd been manipulated by a professional con artist. But everyone agreed that Serena Castellano was an evil incarnate and needed to face prison time for what she'd orchestrated. News outlets picked up the story by morning with headlines screaming about corporate espionage and family destruction. And within 48 hours, 3 different production companies had reached out trying to option the rights for a limited series. Elias spent that first night in his office downtown because he couldn't face the penthouse where Serena's belongings were still unpacked from their planned honeymoon. His lawyers were already filing for annulment based on fraud, and his father's legal team was building a criminal case against the Castellano family that would take years to prosecute fully. But none of that legal machinery mattered to Elias, because all he wanted was to go back 9 months and make different choices, to listen when Ariel begged him to just look at her and see the truth. He'd pulled up her number in his phone 100 times trying to figure out what to say, but every text he drafted sounded hollow compared to the magnitude of what he'd done to her. His mother called at 3 in the morning and told him he needed to fix this immediately because the family reputation was in shambles, and the board was already talking about removing him as CEO. Elias had laughed at this dead, empty sound and told his mother that he didn't care about the company or the reputation or anything except the fact that he had 2 children he'd never held and a wife who flinched when he came near her. His mother had gone silent for a long moment before saying that maybe this was his punishment for marrying beneath himself in the first place, and Elias had hung up on her and blocked her number because some relationships weren't worth saving even if they were blood. Can you imagine your own mother blaming you for being manipulated instead of offering support? Comment if you've ever had family turn on you when you needed them most. By the 3rd day, Elias had sold the penthouse fully furnished and moved into a hotel because he couldn't stand being in spaces Serena had touched. His lawyers had frozen all her access to his accounts and filed charges for fraud and identity theft, and investigators had found evidence of her siphoning nearly $30 million into offshore accounts her father controlled. The Castellano corporate espionage operation was unraveling in real time with federal investigators getting involved, and Serena herself had disappeared somewhere her lawyers claimed was a private medical facility, but was probably just a place she could hide from media that wanted to tear her apart. Vincent Castellano's company stock had crashed and the board had removed him as CEO within 72 hours. And suddenly the revenge plot that was supposed to destroy the Davenports had instead demolished the family that orchestrated it. But while everyone else was focused on legal consequences and corporate fallout, Elias was trying to figure out how to be a father to children who didn't know he existed. He'd sent money to Ariel's account, and she'd sent it back with a note saying she didn't need his guilt money, she needed him to actually show up. He'd sent gifts for the twins, and Tessa had texted him that material things didn't make up for missing the first 3 months of their lives. He'd asked if he could visit, and Ariel had said not yet because she was still too angry to look at him without wanting to scream, and Elias had accepted that answer because he knew he deserved worse. The tabloids were having a field day with the story publishing new details every hour about the manipulation and the fake wedding and the secret babies. Someone had leaked the video evidence to the press, and now everyone could see exactly how Serena had fabricated everything from the stage photos to the fake bank accounts. Public opinion had shifted dramatically in Ariel's favor, with thousands of people sending her messages of support and strangers setting up crowdfunding accounts to help with expenses. Even though Elias was trying to send her money, she kept refusing. The art studio where she used to teach had reached out begging her to come back and offering triple her old salary. And several major news programs wanted exclusive interviews that Ariel kept declining because she said her story wasn't entertainment for people who'd gladly destroyed her 9 months ago when they thought she was guilty. Would you have done the interviews and taken the money, or would you have stayed silent like Ariel? Comment on your choice because I'm genuinely curious what people would do with sudden public sympathy. 2 weeks after the wedding disaster, Elias finally got permission to visit for 30 minutes under supervision at Tessa's apartment. He'd shown up with flowers that Ariel ignored and gifts that Tessa took without comment. And when he saw the twins for the first time in proper light instead of rain and chaos, he'd started crying before he could stop himself. Noah was sleeping, but Luna was awake staring at him with dark eyes that looked exactly like his own. And Ariel had said he could hold her, but only while sitting down, because she didn't trust him not to drop her. Elias had sat on the worn couch with his daughter in his arms and felt the weight of everything he'd missed crushing down on him until he could barely breathe. And when Luna wrapped her tiny hand around his finger, something inside him broke permanently, because this was his child, and he'd thrown her away before she was even born. The 30 minutes had ended too fast, and Ariel had taken Luna back without letting Elias hold Noah, who'd slept through the entire visit. She told him he could come back in another 2 weeks if he proved he was serious about being a father instead of just easing his guilt. Elias had asked what he needed to do to prove it, and Ariel had said she'd let him know when she figured it out. And he'd left that apartment feeling more lost than he had the day he'd thrown her out, because at least back then he'd been certain he was right. His father had called that night demanding Elias stop humiliating himself by begging for forgiveness from a woman who'd already extracted maximum public sympathy. Elias had told his father that if he ever spoke about Ariel that way again, they'd never have another conversation. And his father had sputtered something about family loyalty before Elias hung up and realized that maybe he'd spent his entire life listening to the wrong people about what actually mattered. The board had started proceedings to remove him as CEO, citing personal scandal as grounds for termination, and Elias had let them do it without fighting because running a company suddenly seemed meaningless compared to earning the right to be called father by two children who didn't know his voice. The media coverage continued for weeks, with new angles emerging daily about Serena's past and the Castellano family's history of corporate warfare. Investigators found evidence that this wasn't the first time they'd used manipulation and fraud to attack business rivals, and suddenly half a dozen other cases were being reopened with new suspects identified. Serena herself had been arrested trying to board a flight to a country without extradition treaties, and the footage of her being led away in handcuffs had gotten 20 million views because the internet loved watching villains face consequences. Her father was fighting charges from multiple agencies, and his company was filing for bankruptcy, and the revenge plot that was supposed to elevate the Castellano family had instead destroyed them so completely they'd never recover. Have you ever seen someone's evil plan backfire so spectacularly that they lost everything? Drop a comment, because karma doesn't always work this perfectly, but when it does, it's beautiful to watch. But Elias wasn't celebrating their downfall, because he was too busy trying to rebuild what he'd destroyed with his own hands. He'd started therapy with a counselor who specialized in family trauma and spent 3 sessions just talking about his pride and how it had made him blind to manipulation. He'd cut off his parents completely after his mother sent Ariel a letter suggesting she sign away custody in exchange for a settlement. And when Ariel had forwarded him that letter, he'd gotten his lawyers to draft documents ensuring his parents would never have access to his children without explicit permission. He'd donated $10 million to programs supporting single mothers and domestic violence survivors. And when reporters asked if he was trying to buy good publicity, he'd said no, he was trying to do something meaningful with money that had failed to protect the people who mattered most. 6 weeks after the wedding, Ariel finally agreed to let him hold Noah. And Elias had driven to Malden with hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. His son was awake and fussy, and the moment Elias picked him up, Noah had started screaming, and Ariel had to take him back and calm him down before trying again. The second attempt went better, and Noah had settled against Elias's chest, making small sound that might have been contentment or might have been gas. And Elias had sat there for 20 minutes barely breathing because he didn't want to disturb this tiny person who was half him and half the woman he'd destroyed. When the visit ended, Ariel had walked him to the door and told him he was doing better than she'd expected. And that small acknowledgement had meant more to Elias than every business deal he'd ever closed combined. The visits became weekly, and then twice weekly, and slowly the twins started recognizing him as someone familiar instead of a stranger who made their mother tense. Luna would smile when he talked to her, and Noah would grab his finger and hold on like he was trying to keep Elias from leaving. And every small moment of acceptance felt like forgiveness he hadn't earned but was desperate to deserve. Ariel was still cold and distant, but occasionally she'd laugh at something he said or let him stay an extra 10 minutes. And Elias held onto those moments like evidence that maybe eventually she'd be able to look at him without seeing everything he'd taken from her. But until the doors burst open, nothing would ever truly be resolved. 3 months after the wedding disaster that broke the internet, Serena Castellano's trial began in federal court, and Ariel received a subpoena requiring her testimony about the manipulation and fraud that had destroyed her marriage. She hadn't wanted to face Serena again, but the prosecutors said her statement was crucial to proving intent and showing the human cost of corporate espionage. So Ariel had agreed on the condition that Elias would watch the twins during her testimony because she refused to bring them anywhere near that courtroom. The trial was being broadcast live because public interest was so intense that news networks had fought for exclusive rights. And on the morning Ariel was scheduled to testify, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters and protesters holding signs that said things like "Justice for betrayed mothers" and "Lock her up forever." Elias had driven Ariel to court in silence while the twins stayed with Tessa, And when he'd tried to hold her hand for support, she'd pulled away because physical comfort from him still felt wrong even after 3 months of supervised visits. She'd walked into that courthouse alone wearing a simple dress that made her look smaller than she was. And when she took the stand and swore to tell the truth, Serena had stared at her with hatred so pure it was almost impressive. The prosecutor had asked Ariel to describe her marriage before the accusations, and she talked about paint-stained kisses and burned pancakes, and a man who'd cried happy tears when he found out about the twins. And every word had been designed to show the jury exactly what Serena had destroyed for the sake of her father's revenge. Then came the questions about the exile, and Ariel's voice had cracked when she described being dragged out of the penthouse 7 months pregnant, while security disabled her elevator access and made her walk down 43 flights of stairs. She'd testified about going into early labor from stress and giving birth alone in a county hospital where she couldn't afford proper care because all their accounts had been frozen. She described holding 2 newborn babies in a sister's apartment while watching her husband prepare to marry her destroyer on every news channel and social media platform that existed. The jury had been crying by the time she finished, and even the judge had to take a recess. And when they came back, Serena's lawyer had tried to cross-examine, but couldn't find a single inconsistency in Ariel's testimony, because every word had been devastating truth. Would you have been able to testify without breaking down completely, or would the trauma have been too much? Comment, because I don't know how she held it together. The trial lasted 2 weeks, with witnesses from the bank fraud investigators and corporate espionage specialists, and even the actor who'd been paid to stage the hotel photos. Vincent Castellano had turned on his daughter, trying to get a reduced sentence by claiming she'd acted alone, and Serena had screamed at him in open court, calling him a coward who'd raised her to be a weapon, and was now pretending he'd never loaded the gun. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts including fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and corporate espionage. And when the judge sentenced Serena to 12 years in federal prison, the courtroom erupted in applause that the judge didn't even try to silence. Ariel hadn't been there for the verdict because she'd already given her testimony and refused to waste another moment of her life in the same room as the woman who'd stolen 9 months from her. But the legal victory didn't heal the damage that had been done to Ariel's ability to trust anyone, including herself. She'd started having panic attacks whenever Elias was late for visits because her brain would convince her he was abandoning them again. And therapy was helping, but slowly, because trauma didn't operate on convenient timelines. The twins were 5 months old now and developing personalities that broke Ariel's heart because Noah had Elias's stubbornness and Luna had his quiet intensity. And watching her children become people who resembled their father made it impossible to forget what he'd done even when she wanted to move forward. Elias had been patient through all of it, showing up exactly when he said he would and never pushing for more than Ariel was ready to give. And slowly she'd started to see glimpses of the man she'd married underneath the monster he'd temporarily become. The conversation about reconciliation had happened on a Tuesday evening after the twins had gone to sleep, and Tessa had left them alone for the first time since the church confrontation. Elias had asked if there was any chance Ariel could ever forgive him enough to try again, and she'd been quiet for so long he'd thought she was going to say no. Instead, she told him that forgiveness wasn't a switch she could flip. It was a process that required him to understand that the man who threw her out had killed the woman who'd loved him unconditionally. And whoever they became now would have to be built from scratch with no assumptions about what they used to be. Elias had said he understood and was willing to do whatever it took for however long it took. And Ariel had looked at him with eyes that were older and harder than they'd been a year ago, and told him that wanting to fix something didn't mean he knew how. Can you forgive someone who destroyed you even if they were manipulated into doing it? Comment your honest answer, because this question doesn't have a right response. They'd started family counseling with a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma and rebuilding trust after catastrophic relationship failure. The sessions were brutal, with Ariel finally releasing rage she'd been holding back for months, while Elias sat there taking every verbal blow without defending himself because he knew he deserved all of it and more. She'd screamed at him about the night security had dragged her out and he'd watched from the stairs without helping. about the restraining order that had prevented her from telling him she was in labor, about seeing engagement announcements while she was learning to breastfeed twins alone in her sister's bathroom. Elias had cried through most of it and apologized until the words became meaningless. And the therapist had finally told Ariel that rage was healthy, but at some point she'd need to decide if she wanted to stay angry forever or build something new from the ashes. The decision to try living together again came 6 months after the church confrontation. And even then it was conditional and terrifying for both of them. Elias had bought a house in Newton with enough space for everyone including Tessa, who'd sacrificed so much to keep Ariel and the twins safe when no one else would help. The house had a separate entrance for Tessa's apartment and a nursery that Ariel had decorated herself without Elias's input because she needed to control something in a situation where she'd lost control of everything. They'd moved in on a Saturday with friends helping carry boxes and the twins being passed between people who all wanted to hold them. And when everyone left, and it was just the 4 of them in this new space, Ariel had felt panic rising in her chest. Because what if this was a mistake? And what if he hurt them again? And what if she was being stupid for giving him another chance? But Elias had proven himself in small, consistent ways that slowly rebuilt the foundation trust required. He'd gotten up for every middle of the night, feeding, even though Ariel was breastfeeding and he couldn't actually help, just sitting with her in the darkness, so she wasn't alone. He'd learned how to change diapers and handle tummy time and read the same 3 board books over and over until the twins would settle down for sleep. He'd taken parenting classes and read every book Ariel recommended and asked questions instead of assuming he knew better. And gradually she'd started to see him transform from the arrogant billionaire who'd thrown her away into a father who was desperate to earn a title biology had given him, but behavior had forfeited. The first time they'd kissed again had been an accident 4 months into living together, when Elias had made her laugh so hard she'd spit out her coffee, and he'd reached over to wipe her face, and somehow their lips had touched. Ariel had pulled back immediately with panic in her eyes, and Elias had apologized and left the room. But that night she'd come to his bedroom door and told him she wanted to try, but slowly, because her body still remembered betrayal even when her mind was starting to consider forgiveness. They'd started holding hands during family therapy and then graduating to sitting close on the couch during movie nights. And eventually Ariel had let him kiss her properly for the first time in over a year. And it had felt both familiar and completely foreign, like coming home to a house that had been remodeled while you were gone. Would you have been able to kiss someone who threw you out while pregnant, or would that boundary be permanently closed? Drop your answer, because physical intimacy after betrayal is complicated. 8 months after moving in together, Ariel had finally taken off her wedding ring from their first marriage and put it in a drawer because she said whoever they were becoming deserved new symbols that weren't tainted by what Serena had poisoned. Elias had understood and hadn't pushed for marriage talk because he knew that legal documents meant nothing compared to the daily choice Ariel made to keep trying when giving up would have been easier. The twins were almost a year old now, taking their first steps and saying mama and dada, and completely unaware that their existence had been the center of a corporate espionage plot and a viral internet moment. Luna had Elias's serious face, but Ariel's laugh, and Noah had Ariel's creativity, but Elias's determination. And watching them grow into whole people was the only thing that made the previous year's trauma feel worth surviving. This wasn't love. It was something harder and more deliberate than love. It was the conscious choice to build trust after it had been shattered by lies neither of them had recognized until too late. And standing in their kitchen on a random Sunday morning watching Elias make terrible pancakes while the twins banged spoons on their high chair trays, Ariel had realized that maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting what happened, but about deciding the future mattered more than the past. 1 year after the rain-soaked church confrontation that had exposed Serena's lies to the world, Elias stood in front of the Davenport Properties board and announced he was stepping down permanently as CEO to focus on being the father and partner he should have been from the beginning. The board had protested because the company stock had recovered since the scandal and Elias's redemption arc had actually improved their public image. But he'd been firm in his decision because building empires meant nothing if you lost your family in the process. He'd recommended his cousin Natalie for the position and transferred his voting shares into a trust that would benefit the twins when they turned 18. And when he'd walked out of that boardroom for the last time, he'd felt lighter than he had in years, because money had been his father's priority, but it had never truly been his. Serena was serving her 12-year sentence in a federal facility in Pennsylvania, and according to reports, she spent most of her time in the prison library reading business books and planning the comeback she'd never actually get to execute. Her father, Vincent, had gotten 8 years for his role in the conspiracy, and Meridian Holdings had dissolved completely, with assets sold off to pay legal fees and restitution. The Castellano family name had become synonymous with corporate fraud, and their revenge plot had backfired so spectacularly that business schools were already teaching it as a case study in how not to conduct competitive warfare. Elias had been asked multiple times if he felt satisfaction watching them face consequences, and he'd always said no, because their punishment didn't undo what he'd done to Ariel when he'd believed their lies. The hardest part of rebuilding hadn't been the grand gestures or the public apologies, but the tiny daily moments when Ariel's trauma would surface unexpectedly, and Elias had to sit with the knowledge that he'd caused it. She'd flinch sometimes when he raised his voice even slightly, because her body remembered him screaming accusations while she was 7 months pregnant. She'd panic if he was late coming home, because her brain would convince her he was abandoning them again despite a year of evidence proving otherwise. She'd have nightmares about giving birth alone and wake up crying, and Elias would hold her through it, knowing that comfort from him was complicated, because he was both the source of trauma and the person trying to help heal it. Have you ever had to comfort someone you hurt and felt the weight of knowing you caused their pain? Comment if you understand how complex that responsibility feels. Therapy had helped, but healing wasn't linear, and some weeks were better than others, depending on triggers neither of them could predict. The twins turning 1 had been hard, because Ariel spent the entire birthday party thinking about how Elias had missed their birth and their first 3 months and all the milestones documented in photos he wasn't in. They'd celebrated anyway with Tessa and a few close friends who'd stuck by Ariel when the world had called her a liar. And when Elias had tried to give a toast thanking everyone, Ariel had told him not to, because this party wasn't about his redemption, it was about their children. He'd sat down without arguing, because he was learning that sometimes supporting her meant staying quiet and letting her have spaces where his guilt wasn't the center of attention. The conversation about getting remarried had come up during a therapy session when their counselor asked what commitment looked like to them, now that they'd rebuilt something functional from complete destruction. Ariel had been clear that she wasn't ready for marriage, and might never be ready, because the last time she trusted those vows, Elias had shattered them without hesitation. Elias had said he understood and didn't need a ceremony to prove his commitment, because showing up every day mattered more than any legal document. But privately he'd bought a ring anyway, and kept it hidden, because hope was sometimes foolish, but it was also what kept him working to deserve a second chance he knew he might never fully earn. 18 months after the church confrontation, Ariel had finally let Elias meet her parents, who'd been understandably hostile about welcoming back the man who destroyed their daughter while she was carrying their grandchildren. Her father had actually threatened physical violence during the first dinner, until Ariel's mother had reminded him that holding grudges hurt everyone. And gradually they'd warmed to Elias after watching him change diapers and handle tantrums, and prove through action instead of words that he was trying to be better. Her father had pulled Elias aside one evening and told him that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and if he ever hurt Ariel again, there wouldn't be lawyers or second chances, just consequences. And Elias had said he understood and wouldn't blame anyone if they never fully trusted him again. The twins were growing up bilingual in love and caution, surrounded by adults who adored them, but also carried trauma from the circumstances of their birth. Luna had started calling Tessa her other mama, because Tessa had been there from day one, and Ariel had encouraged it because the family was whoever showed up, not just whoever shared blood. Noah had Elias's business mind already at 18 months old, organizing his toys into categories and getting upset when things weren't where he expected them to be. They were happy children, unaware that their existence had been used as a weapon in someone else's war, and keeping that innocence intact was the goal everyone agreed mattered most. Would you tell your children the full truth about their traumatic origin story when they're old enough, or would you protect them with a gentler version? Drop your answer. because this is a question Ariel and Elias will have to face eventually. 2 years after the rain and the church and the moment everything had exploded into truth, Ariel had finally told Elias she loved him again for the first time since he'd thrown her out. They'd been putting the twins to bed, and Luna had asked why some kids had married parents, and they didn't. And before Elias could answer, Ariel had said that sometimes people needed time to rebuild broken things carefully instead of rushing. After the kids were asleep, she'd found Elias sitting on the back porch, staring at nothing, and she'd sat beside him and said the words he'd been waiting 2 years to hear. He'd started crying and asked if she meant it or if she was just saying it because the therapist thought it would help. And Ariel had told him she meant it, but it was a different love than before, hard-earned and more cautious, and built on foundation of seeing him at his absolute worst and watching him claw his way back to something decent. The proposal had happened on a random Tuesday morning 3 years after the church confrontation, when nothing particularly special was occurring except that Elias had realized he didn't want to wait for a perfect moment that might never come. He'd gotten down on one knee in their kitchen while Ariel was making coffee and the twins were playing with blocks. And he told her that he knew he didn't deserve her yes, but he was asking anyway because building this life together had been the hardest and most important thing he'd ever done. Ariel had looked at the ring, and then at him, and then at their children. And she'd said yes, but only if he understood that this marriage would be nothing like their first one, because she wasn't the woman who'd loved him unconditionally anymore, and he wasn't the man who'd taken that love for granted. They'd gotten married in the same community center where they'd first met with 30 people, who'd actually supported them through the worst year of their lives. No billionaire guest list, and no designer dress, and no elaborate ceremony. Just vows they'd written themselves about choosing each other despite having every reason not to. Ariel's vows had made everyone cry when she talked about how love wasn't enough without trust, and how trust had to be rebuilt brick by brick with consistency and time. Elias's vows had been shorter, because he'd broken down halfway through trying to articulate how grateful he was that she'd given him the chance to prove he could be better than his worst moment. The twins had been flower children who'd mostly just eaten the petals. And when the officiant pronounced them married again, Elias had kissed Ariel softly like he was still asking permission for everything. If someone broke your heart that completely, would you ever marry them again? Or would that boundary stay permanent? Comment your truth, because I want to know where people's lines are. The cost of blind love had been steep for everyone involved, and the scars would never fully disappear no matter how much healing occurred. Ariel still had panic attacks sometimes, and probably always would. Elias still woke up some nights from dreams where he was watching security drag pregnant Ariel out and couldn't make himself move to stop them. The twins would grow up and eventually ask questions about why there were no photos of their father at their birth and why their parents' first wedding anniversary was different from when they celebrated getting back together. Serena would be released eventually and would have to live with being the villain in a story that millions of people knew. And Vincent Castellano would die knowing his quest for revenge had only destroyed his own family while making the Davenport stronger through suffering. But standing in that community center surrounded by people who'd chosen to love them through catastrophic failure and messy redemption, Ariel and Elias had proved that some things could be rebuilt after being shattered if both people were willing to do the work. This wasn't a fairy tale about love conquering all, because love hadn't conquered anything. Commitment and consistency, and the daily choice to keep trying had done the actual work. This was a story about how lies could destroy everything you thought was solid, and how truth could save you if you were brave enough to face it, even when facing it meant confronting your own role in the destruction. Some lies destroy lives and ruin families, and leave scars that never fully heal. But sometimes those same lies reveal who people truly are when everything else is stripped away. And sometimes the person you become after surviving the worst thing you can imagine is stronger than the person you were when life was easy. Ariel had survived being thrown away while pregnant and giving birth alone and rebuilding from nothing. And that survival had transformed her into someone who knew her own worth independent of anyone's validation. Elias had survived realizing he'd destroyed his family because of pride and manipulation, and that realization had transformed him into someone who understood that power meant nothing without wisdom about how to use it. The twins would grow up in a house built on honesty about how broken things could be fixed if everyone involved was willing to do painful work. They'd learn that mistakes didn't have to define you, but accountability for those mistakes absolutely did. They'd understand that family was complicated and forgiveness was a process, and love required more than just feelings. It required action, sustained over time through difficulty. And maybe when they were older and Ariel and Elias finally told them the full story about the church and the rain and the moment everything had almost been lost forever, they'd understand that their parents' greatest gift hadn't been the money or the comfortable life, but the example of how to rebuild after being shattered. If this story moved you, then subscribe so you never miss when truth wins over lies and real love outlasts manipulation. And here's the question I want you to wrestle with in the comments. If love betrayed you once and left you broken in ways that never fully healed, would you ever trust it again, or would you protect yourself by staying closed forever? Because that's the question Ariel had to answer, and her choice to try again despite every logical reason not to might be the bravest part of this entire story.